Welcome back to Introduction to Children's Science Podcasts. Again, I am Lindsay Patterson. I'm the CEO of Tumble Media and the creator, co-host, and executive producer of Tumble, a science podcast for kids. So this is the second part of our 4-part free series about how to make a science podcast for kids. And the first part is up on YouTube if you want to catch up either after this is over. I guess that's the only option if you're watching this live. But if you're watching it after the recording, you can start there because we'll be referring back to some of the things that we learned in the first session. So we talked a bit about what we're going to be covering in the course, the background of how I came to be a children's science podcaster. And we had an amazing interview with Sandon Totten from Brains On, in which we dove into your questions about writing, producing, and sustaining science podcasts for kids. So if you haven't seen that, I highly, highly recommend it. So this week, we are going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of kids podcasting. And I'll start to share my screen here. Slideshow. There we go. So nuts and bolts is kind of a funny expression, but I felt like it was right for this session because I think about getting a podcast started, it's very important to build the foundation. And the nuts and bolts are kind of like, did everything get screwed together right so this can actually take off and hold together as you're making it? And it's not just about what is the content, but also you as a creator. It really takes the two together in order to make a sustainable podcast that is going to really resonate both with an audience and with you in terms of your energy to continue on, which is, I think, one of the most underrated parts of being a content creator in whatever form. Right now, we're talking specifically about science podcasts for kids. But so I'm going to zero in on some of the specific elements about building a foundation for children's science podcasts, because doing that is going to save you a lot of time from figuring things out later that you would have had going from the beginning, and then you can sort of evolve in the right direction. So I'm going to give you an example by sharing a little bit more about how Tumble got started and how my own process in trying to figure out what was the right way to kind of put things together and take off. So getting into it, I think the first question to ask yourself, making a kids science podcast, is why audio? And it's not just because you want to make a podcast because podcasts are fun, which they are. It's that the medium really has to match the message. How are you going to leverage the strengths and unique features of audio to share your message, as opposed to a book, a video, a game, whatever kind of social media for kids might be out there in the future? Like there is at this point like a limitless amount of digital media out there in the world. And why is it a podcast is a very important question to ask from the beginning. And if you haven't made anything yet in audio, those answers can feel very nebulous. So I have sort of the perfect example from the show that I tried to make. Because first of all, I'll share what my first idea was. This is not so responsive as a slideshow. Okay. So when I was starting out, not too long after my first son had been born, I had the idea of making a podcast about how science works, which is, deceptively simple, but how do you actually demonstrate that through audio? So I thought about doing experiments and documenting them, and then somehow bringing listeners along on that journey, whether it would be kids doing the experiments or being able to do the experiments along at home in stages. And it had to be something really accessible that kids could do. So I came up with an episode about creating a baking soda volcano with a twist. It was, can baking soda rockets power a go-kart? So it takes the most classic science, quote unquote, experiment of all time, and actually turns it into something where you're not going to know the outcome. So I got some of my friends together who happen to have PhDs. Again, I am not a scientist, so I don't really know how to do experiments. And we tried to figure out, we tried to build and engineer the structure that would be powered by the power of baking soda explosions. And we strapped my son's moose stuffy to the front of this moving dolly with a wine with a wine rack on top of it. And what happened was, yes, it didn't really go anywhere. And so, like that's science. Maybe we were gonna try again and figure out, how to tweak the idea. But what I did was take video and audio at the same time while we were doing this. So I was doing a lot of video at the time as well. And after it was done, I was really excited to make the video because there was like lots of explosions and people doing things. And I put together the video really quickly and I was really happy with it, how it turned out. And then I turned to making the audio. And I was like 7 pages into writing the script when I just realized that it was boring and there was nothing that was gonna happen that was going to be exciting, and I just didn't have the first idea of how to save this. And I just decided to completely scrap the idea and start over and revise my idea to actually play to the strengths of what I knew how to do rather than what I didn't know how to do. So in audio, I loved interviewing scientists. That was just my favorite thing till this day. Anytime I interview scientists, I just feel really happy and fulfilled. So why not spend my time making a podcast doing something that feels inherently fulfilling to me? So I decided just to, sit down and build a podcast around scientists' own stories of discovery. And so I'm going to play the results of that, the first episode of Tumble for you. It's about 1 minute, so we're going to listen in.
Hi, I'm Marshall.
And I'm Lindsay.
And this is the Tumble Podcast, the show where we explore stories of science discovery.
This week, we have a story about one scientist's quest to solve a mystery that could help save a tiny endangered animal. One you probably haven't heard of. I talked to Dr. Haley Gillespie, who's a good friend of ours.
Yeah, I'm Haley Gillespie, and I am an ecologist, so I study the interactions between organisms and their environment, and organisms and other organisms. When I was a kid, I loved animals.
Everyone loves animals, right? But Haley wasn't just interested in your average dog, cat, or polar bear. When she was a kid on vacation, a more unusual animal caught her eye. An animal that only lives in one park, in one city, in the entire world.
What was it?
The Barton Springs salamander.
All right, that is it. It does go on, I think it was about 15 minutes to explain the story of how Haley found out what salamanders ate. So it is kind of painful to listen to now, but I have made my peace with it. What did it take to make that first episode? Well, I had basically the interview with my friend, which I did while my baby was sleeping. And she might have sounded a little bit quiet because the baby kept waking up and we had to put him back to sleep. And then I had Marshall as a co-host. My friend Sarah pitched in as an editor. We did create an original theme song, but otherwise it was all free music from the internet, and I just produced it start to finish. So next, we're going to take a listen to one of our episodes from last season. This is one of our favorite episodes we did, Why Are Sloths Slow? And I'm going to play a bit more of this episode, and it's going to be about 4 minutes. So I want you to listen for the differences from the first episode and also think about how the episode is structured now, as opposed to the last episode and what those pieces might be doing. Okay, so let's listen to Why Are Sloths Slow? Hi, I'm Lindsay.
And I'm Marshall. Welcome to Tumble, the show where we explore stories of science discovery.
Today we're asking, why are sloths so slow?
But what if they don't think they're slow? Shouldn't the question be, why are we so fast?
Well, from our perspective, sloths move in slow motion, but they have a surprising skill that makes them difficult to study. We'll find out how a sloth scientist got crafty enough to discover why slowness is a sloth's secret to survival. Today we have a question from our listener, Elena.
Why are sloths so slow?
Who said I'm slow?
Is that your sloth impression?
I can run very fast for a sloth.
Sloths are slow, and Elena had an idea of why they might be so sluggish.
I think sloths are slow because of the eucalyptus leaves they eat, like the leaves they eat.
Do sloths eat eucalyptus? I thought sloths lived in South America.
I think koalas are the slow-moving eucalyptus fans, but Elena's right that sloths eat leaves, and she thinks those leaves might give scientists a clue as to why sloths are slow.
They could take some leaves and look into them with a microscope and other scientific things that could help them figure out if the eucalyptus leaves or any kind of leaves have anything to do with slowness.
So maybe the all-leaf diet is what's slowing sloths down, and if they switched to hamburgers, they'd be sprinting. Up there with the cheetah.
Well, let's ask our listeners, why do you think sloths are so slow? And how do you think scientists would find out the answer? Take a minute to think about it, and we'll be back with a sloth scientist to discover the secret to sloth slowness.
I can't wait.
Rebecca Cliff has been studying sloths since before they were cool.
When I first started working with sloths 14 years ago, nobody knew what a sloth was. I'd say to people, I'm a sloth scientist, and they were like, what? What is a sloth?
People didn't know what a sloth is?
It's crazy, but it's true.
Somebody asked me if a sloth was a type of mosquito once. I always remember that. But now if I say I'm a sloth scientist, people are like, oh my God, you've got the best job in the world, because everyone loves sloths.
That's true. Everyone is obsessed with sloths and how weird they are, because they're weird.
They are weird, but Rebecca didn't know anything about sloths the first time she met one.
And I remember that my first thought was like, they're like aliens, right? I just started laughing because they're so weird. You might think sloths are weird from pictures or what you've seen on the internet, but when you meet one, there's something really, really otherworldly about them.
Wait, so here's the thing, is I already think sloths are pretty weird, so it's hard to imagine them being even weirder than that.
We're just not used to that level of slowness in person.
And I think what it is because they don't just move infrequently, they move slowly, and every single part of their body moves slowly. So like when they turn their head, it's very slow. When they blink, it's slow. It's almost like somebody's put them in slow motion.
Okay, well, so to ask Elena's question, why? Why are they so slow?
Well, that's what Rebecca set out to discover when she ventured into the jungle to study sloths.
All right. So, what did you notice between the first episode and the, I don't know, 120th episode? The things that I noticed are that we had a lot more energy just between the three people who are in the episode. Me and Marshall worked to kind of refine our banter back and forth, keep it really humorous and light. Marshall plays a specific role as sort of the learner in this. We also, have the scientists be really bright and cheerful as well. So it took a lot of refining how to get those things out of the interview and also to listen for it. The music, the theme song was the same, but now we have original music, and that is something that we evolved to over many, many years. It really didn't start out that way, but has added so much to the production value of the show. And then specifically, we have listener engagement. We have the question from the kid, and we also had developed a formula for getting those questions and setting them up to really have a story of science discovery, which if you heard in the first episode, we did have that there, but we didn't really have it be kid directed. So we always ask kids when they send us a question, what do you think the answer to your question is, and how would scientists find out? So that really sets it up. And we also give some time for the listeners at home to be able to have a discussion if they want to stop the podcast. Especially this could work really well in a classroom setting where you need to break things up. And then for the scientist in the story, we focus more on giving her great tape up front, rather than her, saying what her name is and her institution. She's just like, sloths are weird and they're like aliens. It creates this, the ability for kids to relate because they also think sloths are weird. And so you start really on the same page before you really get into answering the question and telling what the real story is. So, my takeaway from this is a quote that I really love. I heard it on a podcast once from Roman Mars. I think he was being interviewed. I can't find it again, so I'm paraphrasing it. But if your first episode sounds like your 100th episode, you're doing it wrong. And I love this quote so much because it really gives you permission to just get started and try something out, because there's going to be an evolution. it's going to change in ways that you can't predict. So there shouldn't really be anything stopping you in terms of like, if you have a feeling of, I want it to be perfect the first time out, even if you get something that you're very happy with, yes, you will look back later and say, oh my God, it's so much better now. And that's really the way that it should go. So what does it take to get to the 100th episode, or even the 15th episode, or even just finish your first season? It is an idea of sustainability. Let me see if I can move my face. Here are a few things that I put together for you to kind of check out with whether your idea meshes with it being sustainable. So is it creatively energizing? Is it something that you're like, yeah, I can't wait to try this out. Um, I'm just so excited to do it. Is it relevant to your skill set and expertise? Is it something that you already do quite well that you can build on and just kind of tweak and adjust to making it into a kids science podcast? Do you have access to necessary resources, meaning other expertise, equipment, or funding? What do you consider necessary to be able to do this? And do you know from the get-go that you're going to be able to access it? Or you might want to change your idea if you don't. Do you have time to do this, whether this is part of your day-to-day job title or something that you're doing on the side? Do you know that you actually have the time it takes to make this? Is your format flexible enough that it can evolve and take that evolution? Or are you going to be kind of stuck in certain boxes where you might get tired of doing it a certain way or not being able to be creative? I think that as creators, we've probably all felt this at some time. And do you have a support system both inside and outside of the podcast? Inside, being able to get into it, the edits with you, and outside, do you have someone, giving you the perspective that you need to keep everything balanced? As I like to say, no podcaster is an island. And so speaking of that, building a team, on the last session, somebody asked, how many people does it take to make a science podcast? And that is a really common question. And it can be, from one to many people. It's really a scale. And you don't need a specific idea of like, this is what it takes to make a science podcast. Again, make the thing that's right for you. But I wrote down a list of different roles that I know that I use to make the podcast. And a thing that you can do is take this list, I have a little activity, and fill it out and just say, which roles do you really need? Who is going to fill them? And is that sustainable for you? What do you really need to make the first episode? You might not need sound design to just get it off the ground. You can sort of pick and choose like what is the minimum viable podcast, the MVP of your science podcast. And I think the other part of starting to think about the content is to create a sense of purpose and direction. And I kind of chanced into doing this between the time that I was trying out my first idea and the second idea, because I found I really needed to refocus and figure out what it really was that I was trying to do through the podcast. So I wrote this manifesto, and you can see the whole thing is on our website. But the first part was, if kids understand how science works, the future will be a better place. And the second is, let's make more podcasts for kids, which It doesn't go into Tumble itself, but was also a thread for me in my career as a kids podcaster. So we found ourselves as a team returning to this document over and over again, to kind of reinvigorate, our own sense of what we were doing and also communicate what is the central purpose of this podcast. Whether that's to listeners, to potential funders, it became a really foundational document. And it's really easy to create your own. You don't have to call it a manifesto, but you can call it a statement or, a mission statement. Just answer these questions, sit down and write for 10 to 20 minutes and figure out what you want to do. What makes you want to make this podcast? Why is it necessary for children? Because we all know that communicating about science is necessary for children and their future. And how do those two answers together inform your approach to how you're going to make this podcast and how it's going to be unique to what you're trying to do? Okay, so let's get into the creator part of the nuts and bolts. I put together a list of what I think are the essential things to consider when you're making a science podcast for kids. And the first, because we're talking about kids, is age. So, kids media is constantly categorizing kids into different age ranges. This is very different from an adult podcast where you're like, well, I feel like that's kind of more for boomers than it is for millennials, than it is for Gen Z. But for kids, it's like, each age has a different developmental stage, a different way of relating to stories, a different way of relating to media. And it also, like, kids podcasts just seem to hit in a certain way that, if you're creating something for an age that you state, like say you're saying, oh, this is going to be for ages 8 to 12. If it feels like it's really hitting below that, kids will feel like they're being talked down to. Or if it hits above that, they won't be able to follow the story and kind of tune out, as well as the element of the adults. The parents are always trying to determine what's age appropriate for their kids to listen to. And so you kind of have to thread the needle and hit exactly on target for parents to be like, yes, this is for my child, and for kids to feel like they're speaking to me and my interests. So, when you're talking about what age appropriate means, you want to think about language, what words you're using, what phrases you're using, the entire pantheon of language, their existing level of knowledge in science and their interests in science, as well as the cultural references you make. Like, there's so many times that, I write a little bit of a joke or a reference, and Marshall, who has a lot of teaching experience, will be like, kids don't talk about that anymore. So it's almost like fact checking when you're targeting for age. You really have to check all of your assumptions for things that you're writing and make sure that they're really on target. And a good way to do that is to think about an ideal listener. Someone in the last session asked if you need to have kids to make a science podcast for kids, and I'll say absolutely not. I happen to have a kid, but he was only 6 months old, 6 months old when we started, so he wasn't offering any feedback for quite a long time. But you do want to know kids and understand kids and be able to relate, know what it's like to talk to children because that's what you're doing with a podcast. If you are making a podcast with a child, then you have a much easier job because they're really going to be constantly checking you almost like as an editor. Again, like it it is ideally a partnership between you as an adult producer and the child, and definitely let them direct it as much as they can and don't push back on what they feel is right in terms of age appropriateness. Unless they like to push boundaries, then you might want to. But anyhow, if you don't work with a kid, it's a really good idea to have a focus group. Once you have some content, uh, you can send it to all the expert podcast adults in the world, but the people who are really going to provide you with the meaningful feedback are children. So the next thing is to consider the environment where they're listening. Now, we talked a little bit about this in the last session. Um, Vehicles are very popular places to listen to podcasts, but at home is even more popular. At the bottom of this chart is at school. That's 29% of where monthly podcast listening happens, which is, the lowest on this chart, but also not shabby. So you can think about what do kids have access to, what they might be doing in this, because that is going to help clue you in to design elements within the podcast. In addition to where they're listening, it's also when they're listening. This comes from a study we did with Kids Listen. You can see that podcasts really, for listeners, fit into a routine. We're seeing spikes at morning commutes, after school time, and bedtime routines. And then from there, you can guess, where are they listening? They're in the car on a morning commute. They're at home during bedtime. So that can help you design moments of interaction, which we talk about when we talk about engagement. How can listeners interact with the podcast while they're listening? So one of the things that we really think a lot about in Tumble is, how do we keep everything accessible to kids no matter where they are? We ask them direct questions. We have, moments to pause and think about things, just like light, they can listen through to the podcast just quietly, but sometimes you have special opportunities to say, like, oh, this podcast is about color, look around and see, what kinds of colors do you see? Like, as much as you can play back and forth with the idea that they're anywhere out experiencing in the world and they have the time to look around or to do something else, build that into your podcast and be very direct about it. The other element of engagement is after they're done listening. Um, as we saw in the research from last week, people do things after they listen to kids' podcasts, whether it's kids on their own, kids and their co-listeners, or reaching out and directly interacting with the podcast. So with Tumble, we have listener questions. We've started doing quiz shows. Kids do like to connect to the podcast directly, but also please keep in mind that there are a lot of laws about how you interact with children, and so that's a very good thing to research before you tell kids to send things in or give certain information about. It's essential. The other thing is to consider the market. Get to know what other science podcasts exist, what other kids podcasts exist, and what they do, what different elements that really work for those shows. So you can learn from what other people have done, but also figure out how can you differentiate your podcast. Yes, there are a lot of podcasts that take kids' questions and answer them, but there are different ways to approach these things, and it can be unique, and that can be a strength. I think, the thing is that even there's lots and lots of space in kids' podcasts right now. There's lots of different kinds of science. So there's always space to have something that really appeals to a specific audience. Think back to your ideal listener. What kind of audience are they a part of? Um, and how can you meet them where they are? I think the audience for kids' podcasts right now is a lot smaller than the podcast audience for adults. And there's lots of room to grow, as we found out with the first data that I shared last week. There's 63% of kids are aware of kids' podcasts, but a much smaller percentage actually considers themselves monthly or weekly listeners, which weekly listeners are really the ideal. We want kids to listen as much as possible. And through my experience and also learning about the research, the best way to grow that audience is to create diverse content to bring more diverse audiences into podcasts. And especially when you're talking about science podcasts and the, kinds of engagement that we saw through that Brains On study that I mentioned in the first series session, there is huge potential to really increase science literacy and foster STEM identities through science podcasts. So I'm going to transition into our interview with Nuria Net, who is working on the Spanish adaptation of our show, Tumble in Español, and she is the co-founder of La Coctelera Music. So we actually met, we were both living in Barcelona and we were pregnant with our second childs together, both of us had our second kid around the same time. And this is actually a picture of us at one of their birthday parties. So let's listen to the video. She shares a bit about how we got started. And we're going to be talking about the importance of making a podcast that is culturally relevant to the audience that you're trying to reach. Some of the interesting things about using language in podcasts for kids and tackling the challenges of building a new audience. So let's start with that video.
Hi, Lindsay. So happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
I thought it would be great to have you here because you are the co-host of Tumble in Español, Tumble's adaptation into Spanish, as well as the executive producer. So can you just start by telling me a little bit about your background and how you got into children's science podcasting?
Sure. Well, I'm a journalist by trade. I started my career in New York City covering Latin music and culture. I've worked for different media outlets, from magazines back in the early 2000s, all the way to television at Univision, where I was the editor of the music section of the website. This is my first foray into children's content, thanks to you. It all happened during the pandemic, where we were stuck at home, and there was a need for kids to have more information about the virus and the pandemic. So we volunteered to adapt into Spanish an episode of Tumble that you had produced, and we just took the leap, without really thinking it much. We just wanted to do something at that moment to put information out there. So that was how we started. And after that, the The impact was immediate. We got ordered a first season of Tumble Español, and that's how we got started. And that was 4 years ago already.
Yeah. And I remember going back and forth with you trying to figure out if anyone had done a translation or adaptation of a children's science podcast into Spanish. And at that time in 2020, we were both kind of shocked that it hadn't happened. How did you get into audio from all of the print and digital work that you've done in the past?
It was an evolution, as a journalist, having worked in print first and then in digital. As a listener too, as a consumer, I started consuming a lot of podcasts around the boom of podcasting. I think I started in 2008, but really got into it in 2014 with Serial. So I just saw the opportunity as a storyteller to tell stories in a more long form way, in a more emotional way. I was just really excited about the format. And when I moved to Spain after living in the States and I became an entrepreneur, I needed something I could do independently and something I could offer, a format I could offer clients, other media companies, other journalists, institutions. So that's how I got into podcasting as a career.
Yeah. And I feel like your career is this representation of like bridging so many different worlds. Like, first of all, you grew up in Puerto Rico, now you live in Madrid, you work both in Spanish, you work both in Spain and in the US, and you're working with adult podcasts, you're working with kids podcasts, you're working in English, you're working in Spanish. So I want to kind of like take all of that mix and figure out like how you kind of put it all together, and especially when it comes to children's science podcasts and the work that you've done with Tumble en Español. So the first question that we got from one of our attendees is, how does culture come into play in a science podcast? I think, can you start by telling me like a little bit about the process of how you do the adaptations and make them culturally relevant?
Sure. Yeah, for me, being bilingual and multicultural has been at the center of my identity, and also as a journalist and storyteller. When we take a script from Tumble, we don't only adapt it to my own and my co-hosts' way of talking, but also we really look at the content culturally. So, for example, if you remember that episode about the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, when we were reading it, we're like, oh, this asteroid hit near the Yucatan Peninsula, so near Mexico. And the word of the asteroid is actually a Mayan word. So we made kind of like a bigger deal in our script about that fact, because it's actually a source of pride. Like, look, like there's an asteroid name with a Mayan name, which comes from Mexico, Latin America. So those little details, are very important to us. Another example, when we featured an astronaut who was Latina, we also mentioned her parents came from Cuba, and her family was so proud when she became an astronaut, because it's something our audience, we know that it's going to resonate with them. Our main audience are Latino families in the United States, so most of them are immigrants or children of immigrants. We also know we have Spanish learners who are not necessarily Latino, but we still want to make Tumble en Español culturally relevant that way in highlighting a lot of the Latino aspects of it.
Mm-hmm. And so that's sprinkled like throughout the podcast, like you are bringing your perspective to it, you and your co-host Alvaro. And that's what makes it so incredible, I think. To hear the podcast, but also to hear just it's sort of like turned around a different perspective, and to translate that to the audience. Why do you think, just to put it in plain terms, why do you think it's so important that podcasts be culturally relevant?
I mean, as a Latina in the United States. This is changing, but it's so hard to see yourself represented in media, in stories, and even more for our kids, right? So I think any chance we can get to be represented is so important. Yeah, so that's the main thing. I was just also remembering in another episode, I think you might have mentioned Taylor Swift as a pop star, and we changed it to Shakira. It's not like we don't love Taylor Swift. We do, and Latinos do, and everyone worldwide does. But we just thought it was a bit funnier, or a bit, again, more relevant, authentic, to mention like our own superstar, Shakira, who's also worldwide famous. And even if you're not Hispanic, you still love her. So, we take those liberties, and we are really grateful for you guys to let us play around with it, because it really is creating a new, it's Tumble coming to life in Spanish, and also, again, in a culturally relevant way. So I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And do you think the audience, like in terms of the difference between a translation, because like right now in podcasting, we're thinking about AI, like, oh, everything can be multilingual, and it's just so cheap to do it. Like, what
Right.
is the what is the value of having it actually be adapted versus translated?
Yeah, it's tremendous value. It is part of the storytelling. I mean, I wonder if the AI, I don't think it would change Taylor Swift to Shakira. I don't think it would make that leap, right? Like, that's something that it takes experience and the authenticity of the living experience to do. So I think it makes all the difference. I think we even did a test this year on our Instagram page. We took one bite of a scene of Tumble, the original Tumble, and we ran it by AI. So we had the AI voice, just translated straight up. And then we compared it to our version, and it was so different. And we still like ours better, obviously.
Yes, I do too. Okay, so with your production company, La Coctelera, one of the things you do is create bilingual versions of podcasts. What does it mean to be bilingual, and like what does it take to produce a podcast in both languages?
I gotta say, just because we're doing stuff in Spanish, it doesn't mean one size fits all. Spanish is spoken by 500 million people in the world from dozens of countries. And it's really hard to make something that is really, that's gonna resonate with everyone, right? It's impossible. If you try to do that, then you're trying to do neutral Spanish, which is something that's been tried to do in the past in advertising and other types of marketing. But we think that's not, as storytellers, we don't think that's culturally authentic or relevant. So we try to make our differences as Spanish speakers, both culturally, linguistically, our accents. We try to make that an asset and not something negative. So for example, in Tumble, the Spanish I speak is Caribbean inflected, my accent, because I grew up in Puerto Rico. My co-host is from Spain, so he speaks like a Spaniard. We could try to speak both neutral and like, but no, what we want to do is I have my accent, he has his. And sometimes when he says a word that I don't say in my country, I make a deal out of it. And I say, wait, do you mean actually this word? And then we laugh about it. So we actually showcase our differences, and it's a language learning tool, even if you're already a Spanish speaker, because you're like, oh, okay. So in Colombia, they say it this way, in Spain, this other way. So again, you're learning more about the different types of Spanish and different Latin American cultures in that way. So each project we do, we really need to take a hard look at what's our target audience, where are they located geographically, and then try to adapt it that way. Obviously in the States, there's more Mexican Americans than other types of immigrants or people or other countries of origin. So that's why mostly I think in most media, you pretty much here the Mexican accent is kind of like the dominant, because it is representative of most people of Latin descent in the States. And also Mexico in itself, it's a huge important market. But in our productions, not because of that fact, we always use Mexican talent or Mexican stories. It really depends what's the best talent for the role, who we're trying to reach, what does the story ask for. So again, it's just very particular and different.
Yeah. And sort of on top of the language question, are there metaphors or analogies that work better in one language and have to be adapted? Like, what do you do when you come across that, whether it's in English, whether it's, saying that's in one country and not in another?
That's been one of the toughest things about adapting Tumble, because there's a lot of humor and jokes. And sometimes we've tried to translate the joke literally, and it doesn't land, it doesn't work with us. So we just change the joke to something we would say in Spanish, or, even songs that we've also done differently, because the context is different, especially because in the podcast we've been adapting, for example, Tumble, it is based on two people interacting with each other. It's not fiction. It's not based on characters. Like, it's based on real people. So that's why instead of me playing Lindsay and Alvaro playing Marshall, we play Nuria and Alvaro, because we need to, again, tell our own jokes and have our own interaction, not mimicking. Again, it's not Lindsay and Marshall in Spanish, it's Nuria and Alvaro. So that's where all the difference lies.
Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends on like what format your podcast is taking.
Exactly.
If it's fiction, it's going to be easier to just be like, okay, we're writing this whole thing differently. And the approach you've taken is to just be like, okay, we're our own characters with our own jokes. And, in Tumble, the back and forth between the two hosts is a huge part of the show.
Mm-hmm.
So you would say like you need to kind of take a look at like what is the key to the show and go from there.
Yes.
One more language question. If you're either adapting a podcast or you're doing a version of the podcast in two different languages at the same time, what do you assume about the level of the listener's proficiency in those languages, especially when it comes to kids' podcasts?
I mean, if I'm doing a podcast in another language, I need to assume that audience understands fully that language. But when it comes to kids, we're already saying things a bit slower or explaining things, especially when it's a science podcast. There's some terms that are abstract or more complicated. So we're already trying to explain things in the best way possible. So that's why children's podcasts are a good learning tool for people who are learning languages. Even though that's not the main audience for Tumble en Español, we have found it is a great way for families to practice their Spanish or learn their Spanish, because it is done in a way that's for kids. It's used also for people whose Spanish is not their first language.
Yeah, so it could be adults in language learning classes, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so like when we're making Tumble, like we're trying to keep it age appropriate from the get-go of thinking of like who is that ideal listener. When you adapt that into Spanish, how are you thinking about like keeping that on the level as well?
That's been one of the hardest things for me, because I am used to writing for an adult audience, an adult listener. So, I mean, I am a mom, so I kind of and my oldest son is 8 right now. So when I'm writing and adapting, I'm trying to say, okay, would my son understand this? How would I explain it to my son? So I kind of have to revise my copy several times, keeping that younger audience in mind. That doesn't come naturally to me because I'm not used to that.
I want to talk a little bit about what is the market for Spanish language kids podcasts. This is something we've kind of been working on together. What would you say is the, environment out there right now, and what are some of the challenges of getting listeners for a Spanish language kids podcast?
I think in English, you've gone through these challenges in making the case that podcast as a format is a great way for kids to get off the screens, to learn, to listen to stories. In Spanish, I feel like there hasn't been a consortium of people who make kids podcasts. So I think we need to show that there's an audience for this, that it's a great alternative to screens, all the positive aspects of storytelling in podcasts. So I think it's wide open. There's so many opportunities. It's very small right now, the market. So I really encourage people, to go for it because the possibilities are endless. And we see now that people like Disney are doing more stuff in the space. I think it's only a matter of time that it's going to open up more opportunities in Spanish as well.
And I do want to add on, I think we started this project just being as you mentioned, with COVID, we took the file and you just completely switched it over and got it back. I think if we had more time and resources, we would want to have a more integrated workflow where we're kind of really understanding how the English and the Spanish interacts, and then to do the Spanish, understanding the points of workflow and working together a bit closer would be my ideal as well.
Yeah, but in a way, we're kind of workshopping as we go, right?
Yeah.
So if we had from the beginning, we're going to do this and that, it's just so hard to see that before you start. So actually, for those of you watching, if you have already a project and you do speak another language, maybe just try to adapt it. You don't have to have a completely fully formed plan or execution. It's really important to workshop and just try to learn as you go. Because that's how you really find the kinks and what can be improved. And from this experience, we've been able to develop other kids podcasts with these learnings and already having, okay, this is the vision, this is how we're going to execute it. So just doing this podcast has helped us so much in our other productions, kids and otherwise.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it got started just as an experiment, hey, let's do this. We did it really quickly. It got it off the ground. We knew that it was something that people were interested in. And it led to a much larger collaboration between us, where now as a kids podcast company, we're able to say, hey, we have Spanish partners. We can do this in Spanish.
Mhm.
And you as a, boutique multilingual production company can say, hey, we can do kids podcasts too. And, English, Spanish, bilingual, now that we've established leadership, we can see what kinds of flexibility we have and sort of work on the market together. And that's the main thing. Not the main thing. I appreciate your friendship, and I also appreciate.
No, but it's funny, right? We
Yeah.
started with this thing and now we have this partnership, but we didn't set out to do a partnership. It's kind of
Yeah, honestly, because I knew you for many years before we even talked of working together. We never talked of working together before it was can you translate this COVID
Mhm.
podcast? And I didn't really see the intersectionality between us. So it was a very organic process.
And I didn't think I could do, science content. Obviously, again, the script comes already vetted from your original. If I were doing something from scratch, I would need a fact checker or scientist, consultants, So for me, it's been a great way to dip my toes into science, having already the seal of excellence from Tumble. And now I want to do more.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the webinar, on the course, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Just whatever
Thank
excuse I
you.
can get. All right.
Good luck with the course, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks to Nuria for joining us. You know, it was really interesting to hear what she had to say about, bringing identity, language, and culture into podcasting, and also the challenges of building a new audience. As she mentioned, the current market is quite small, and it really, when you're starting a kids podcast and you're thinking about your ideal audience, you also need to kind of have a plan for tapping into that and bringing them from other places, because that is how we build a strong and diverse listenership with strong and diverse content. So let's get back to the screen share. Okay. All right. So I want to end again on a mindset question. And this goes back to thinking about really what it takes to make the thing that you want to make. What resources do you need to make a science podcast for kids? How will you get them? Kind of looking around and thinking, sometimes you might find the resources that you need in unexpected places. Nuri and I did not know for a long time that we could work together and we could combine our strengths to provide different elements to each other. So I think it's a really good example of, you know, building partnerships and building relationships and just kind of planting seeds and seeing what grows at the same time of, going ahead and figuring out just how do I do the thing that I want to do now. So with that, thank you all very much for attending the session. The next session, I am going to continue with the construction metaphor and call it Digging Deep Science Writing for Kids Audio. So we're really going to start to nail down what do you need to actually write an outline, write a script that is going to work for the ear. And we're going to be joined by Dr. Peter Walters, who is an accessibility expert and an educational consultant on the research project that we're doing around empowering blind students in STEM through podcasts. So I will look forward to seeing you then. And again, thank you so much for joining us.